Hey, you guys ready to go? Yeah, go ahead. All right, good morning. I think officially good afternoon, everybody. Yes. It's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Malloy. Jeff began his professional career at Price Waterhouse in Philadelphia, where he also received his CPA. Jeff then moved to San Francisco area, and he began working in the nonprofit arena, where he was the general manager at the American Conservatory Theater for about 11 years. And then as a grantee of the James Irvine Foundation, he was hired as Director of Finance and Administration there, and he served there for about 8 years. And during that time, he was also a part of the first Career Pathways cohort. And then in 2015, Jeff went on to become the Chief Operating Officer and Corporate Treasurer at the Hastings Simmons Foundation, where he is currently. And he will walk us through the financials, how to read a financial statement, and answer any questions, and also maybe talk to us about some issues about PRIs and tax issues and things like that. So welcome, Jeff, and I'll hand it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but it's been sort of a crazy week here, so we decided to go with this format. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Okay, I am going to share my screen in just a minute, and we'll go through a PowerPoint deck, but obviously I'll be able to hear you if you have questions, and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. But please feel free as we're going through if you have any questions. The nature of this presentation is sort of what you need to know as foundation leaders about looking at the financial statements of your organization. So we'll be looking mostly at foundation financial statements as we go through some examples, but just know that these same skills and everything we're going to talk about can be used to look at the financial statements of your grantees. So if you're helping your program teams, or if any of you are on program teams, as I'm sure many of you are, these same skills can be helpful in looking at the financial due diligence of your grantees when you're considering risk to your foundation. Okay, so I am going to try and share my screen here. Let's see how this goes. Hang on one sec. Go. And I want to go in the slideshow, right? Which way can I see it? All right, so here we go. Again, finance, what you as a foundation leader need to know. And why are we even talking about this? Basically, the primary tenet as you're looking at finances, either for your organization, for any other organization, is to consider the risk. So it's risk to not only your own organization, but personal risk and reputational risk. When a foundation makes a grant to a grantee, it's a very public thing. And I've got sort of a worst case scenario story from when I was with the Irvine Foundation. We had a major outstanding grant. It was several $1 million to a very high profile arts organization. And one day, unbeknownst to us or with no warning, that organization appeared on the front page of the Los Angeles Times as having declared bankruptcy. So the chair of our board called our CEO and said, "What are you guys doing? Why did you make this, multi-million-dollar grant to this organization that is about to declare bankruptcy?" And at that point in time, the vice president of programs came to me and said, "Can you help us devise sort of a financial due diligence process so that this never happens again?" Because it was clearly a mark against our foundation in reputational risk, because we hadn't noticed that this foundation, this organization, very large organization, but was in such dire financial straits that it was about to declare bankruptcy. So risk is definitely something you need to think about. And also there are a number of regulatory issues that we as foundation leaders need to think about. We're all very familiar with all of the IRS rules that govern everything we do with foundations. But then there are these other things as well. The Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, UPMIFA, you may have heard about that. State regulatory agencies, federal regulatory agencies, the Department of State. There's a number of regulatory agencies that we need to be sensitive to when we're putting together our financial statements and when we're looking at the financial statements of our grantee partners. Your auditors will be obviously looking at all of this and making sure that any statements comply with these various regulatory compliances. So your responsibilities as a leader are one, a fiduciary responsibility. As a leader of an organization, of a foundation, you have a fiduciary responsibility. And basically it's to protect the organization's resources, to steward them well. You want your money to be going towards, making impactful grants, not to be frittered away or used for things that don't really further the mission of the organization. And also with foundations, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, transparency. Transparency is mandated by many laws, and many foundations choose to go beyond what is required. You may have heard of the Glass Pockets Initiative, where many foundations are posting full financial statements and tax returns on their websites. So there are a lot of people looking at the financial statements of your organization, some that are with you and some that are out to try and thwart your efforts, particularly in the current administrative climate that our country finds itself in. So just again, your responsibilities as a leader, because we're being so transparent, you want to make sure that things are right and really reflect what's going on in your organization. So let's dive into some basics about looking at financial statements. The first thing I want to cover, and when we talk about audited financial statements, obviously the audit is important. And when your auditors complete their review of your financial statements, they issue what's called an audit opinion. And this is a very key document. And again, here's an example for the Arcus Foundation, their most recent audit. And their auditors, O'Connor Davies, issue this opinion. And the key language in any audit opinion is this: in our opinion, the financial statements referred to above present fairly. And those are key words you want to always look for, because if those words aren't there, there's a problem with this audit. Or it wasn't an audit, it was something called a review or a compilation, which is much less in scope. But these are key words in any audit, and you want to always make sure that they're there, and particularly when you're looking at grantee financial statements. Because if they say they present fairly, that means that, okay, this organization is on track, the financial statements actually reflect what went on in that organization. So these are key words. Here's another format that PricewaterhouseCoopers sometimes use. It's a one-paragraph thing. It's unique to their firm. But again, you can see the in our opinion and the present fairly still exist. So again, key statements you always want to see in any audit opinion. Let's now look at the statement of financial position. This is one of the three primary financial statements. It used to be called a balance sheet, and I kind of missed that. I think that was more reflective of what this is. Basically, what it shows is all of the assets of an organization, the things that they own. You can see here cash, investments, that type of thing. The stuff that has tangible value. And then it shows the liabilities, that which that organization owes to others. You can see here accounts payable, grants payable. Of course, for a foundation, that's usually the largest amount. Anything it owes. And then the difference between the thing it owns and that which it owes are called net assets. And you can see here that they're broken down into a variety of categories, but it's net assets. It's kind of what's left over. After you take away everything that's owed against what is owned, this is what's left over. And net assets, that's a key figure, particularly when you're looking at grantee financial statements. You want to make sure that that number is as positive and as large as possible, because it does give you a good indication of the organization's health. Now, why this is, one other thing I wanted to point out, this is a comparative statement. Very important as a leader, you want to be able to see kind of trends here. Like if you look down to the very bottom line, or the next to the bottom line there, the total net assets, you can see that in 2014, they were 104 million. In 2015, they end up at 149 million. So that's a really positive jump. So that starts to give you some indication of what is happening. And it's not just a sort of snapshot in time. You're actually able to see there over a 1-year period that this organization increased its financial health quite a bit. And I said that it used to be called the balance sheet, and that is because total assets should always equal total liabilities and net assets. And you would be surprised how many times in my career I've been handed a balance sheet that doesn't balance. I can't tell you how many times grantees have submitted financial statements to my foundation, whether it be here or at the James Irvine Foundation, and the balance sheet didn't balance. That's an immediate key that somebody doesn't know what they're doing who's putting together these statements, or we're careless in putting together the statements. So always make sure that's the first thing I do whenever I get a set of financial statements, is I make sure that they balance, that the balance sheet balances. So here's just another example of a balance sheet. This is Community Foundation of St. Joseph County. You can see this one is not comparative. So this only gives you one snapshot in time. It goes over, oh, sorry, I don't have the second page of that one there. It's just the first. This had a second page that continues on with liabilities and does have net assets that then totaled the total assets. Here's a more recent statement, the Bill and Melinda Gates. And you can see, again here, a key thing to look at is the change in net assets. So if I were reviewing this set of financial statements, I would want to know, okay, what went on in 2015? They're changing, they had a drop in net assets, and you can see up at the top here, this is in thousands, but that's a $5.5 billion drop in net assets in 2015. That's a lot of money. So I'd want to know what went on there. You can see in 2016, it's much more positive, a $331 million increase in net assets. So obviously something unusual happened in 2015, and that kind of gives you the start of what you need to look for when you're looking into this organization. Let's see. Oh, here's the other half of that other balance sheet. We put the Bill and Melinda Gates in between. Sorry about that. Let's go on then to the statement of activities. This used to be called the income statement or the profit and loss statement. It's now called the statement of activities. It shows the same type of information. This shows you what happened during a year. So here is an example, the Jacobs Center for Neighborhood Innovation, which is an operating foundation. And you can see here that the first thing is sort of income. They call it changes in unrestricted net assets, but you see the subtitle there is revenue and gains. And you can see that first subtotal is net assets released from restriction after satisfaction of program restriction, and then it gets to total revenue gains and other support. So that's the total income, and it's something that is important. Then, of course, they list all of their expenses, and at the bottom line is the increase or decrease in net assets, formerly referred to as the net income or net loss. So you can see here again, 2011 seemed like it was a pretty good year. They had, a net income or increase in net assets of $4 million. I'd want to know what happened in 2012, because suddenly they went from a $4 million gain to a $7 million loss. And we'll talk about categories of net assets. There are unrestricted net assets, which are sort of the normal operating assets of an organization. There are temporarily restricted net assets. Those are things where a donor has put some kind of a restriction on it. For example, if you give a multi-year grant to an organization, that organization has to put like the second and third year of that grant into temporarily restricted net asset, meaning that they have to restrict them until that year 2 and year 3, because that's when you as a donor have said that they can use them. And then the final category is permanently restricted, and permanently restricted means endowment. if a donor says, I never want you to touch this corpus, you can only use this to generate income and you can spend the income, but that corpus that they've given and permanently restricted as an endowment, that relates to permanently restricted. And you can see here where we have the net assets released from restriction. So for example, if somebody gave this organization a multi-year grant, they're able to release some of those net assets in each year because the time restriction has expired. And you can see down here, you can see that it balances where they have the change in temporarily restricted net assets. So it's coming out in one place, going to the other, it nets out to zero. So there's no real bottom line impact. It's just moving from temporarily restricted to unrestricted. Is that clear? I know that's kind of a lot. Let's take a look at another example that might make that a little clearer. Oh, and one other thing I did want to point out, we'll get to this in a few minutes. You can see at the bottom of this statement of activities, it says, see notes to the consolidated financial statements. I want to hit that pretty hard because the footnotes of any financial statements contain a wealth of information that you may never get from the face of these statements that we've been looking at. And indeed, that worst case scenario that I talked about at the Irvine Foundation where our grantee had declared bankruptcy, sure enough, there was a footnote that talked about the fact that they were borrowing against their permanently restricted endowment without the permission of their donors. They actually disclosed that in their footnotes. And had anybody at my foundation read those footnotes, they would have seen that there was a huge problem going on. But because we didn't, we missed it. And it was not evident from the face of the financial statements, which is all our program team had looked at the time. So here's another presentation of a statement of activities. And this is from the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation. I like this format better because it's much clearer about what is unrestricted, what is temporarily restricted, and what is permanently restricted. You can see here they have a small endowment, the permanently restricted column, of $60,000. Very clear, this particular year, no activity in the endowment whatsoever. Very normal, you know, nothing unusual there. They're temporarily restricted. This is where donors have put some kind of a time restriction on these funds. And you can see that in 2015, 1.12 million were released from restriction, and you can see them moving over to the unrestricted column. Again, that's just because the time restriction on those assets had been released, and they were now able to take them into the unrestricted column. Again, you see that it nets out to zero. And at the end of the year, they ended up still with 24 million in temporarily restricted assets. So they still have these other grants that still have time restrictions, and in future years, they will be moving over to the unrestricted column. So again, I like this. To me, this is a much clearer format, much easier to understand. And you can see again, it always nets out to zero. So that's something you should look for. And then this is the key thing you want to focus on. What really happened with net assets during the year? Again, this presentation makes it very clear, very strong year. I would have no concerns in reading this particular statement of activities. Here's another example, San Francisco Foundation. Again, that same sort of presentation with the multi-column. Again, I think it's stronger. So this is something that you should look for. If you have a choice, I would suggest this is the best kind of presentation for a statement of activities. And again, it's everything we've talked about. I won't go through it again. It's just another example. The last basic financial statement is the statement of cash flows. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because even the Financial Accounting Standards Board has realized that this statement is virtually useless to the readers of financial statements, and they're in the process of changing all of the requirements for it. You know, after 30 years in accounting, I still get confused when I read statements of cash flow. But let me try to tell you what it attempts to show. So it starts off with the cash, and this is not a great let's see, you can see it's almost all the way at the bottom of the statement where it says cash and cash equivalents beginning of the year. Typically, that's the first line on a cash flow statement, so you know where you're starting from. But what it attempts to do is show what happened with cash. Forget about income, forget about net assets, but just what happened with cash or cash equivalents, which are those kind of marketable securities that can easily be turned into cash. So you first start with your change in net assets, or remember, it used to be called net income or loss. And for example, here in 2016, this organization, San Francisco Foundation, had a loss of 33, I guess this would be $1 million. So you start out with a loss, but not all of that was cash. So then you try to figure out, okay, well, what happened with cash? You look at the net cash used or provided by operating activities, and you can see there are various components of that. But basically what they're saying is not only did they have a loss of 33.89 million, but then they also used operating cash in addition, another $2.2 million. Then you look at the investing activities. Well, they didn't have a good year there either, because their investing activities, they probably, well, as you can see, they purchased more investments than they received from proceeds. So again, more cash used, $963,000 used in cash there. So the change in cash and cash equivalents was actually $3.2 million for the year. That's the total of the 2.2 used by operating activities and the 963,000 used by investing activities. And then you can see the cash at the beginning of the year, less this 3.2 million. This is the cash at the end of the year. And hopefully, if you looked at their balance sheet, you would see that that's the amount that appears on their balance sheet as cash and cash equivalents as of the end of 2016. So again, it's a very confusing statement, but that's what it attempts to show. Let's hope that the Financial Accounting Standards Board comes up with a much more useful statement, because typically people don't look at this. Now, internally, I will say, like, we live and die by our internal cash flow statement here. That just tells us what cash we have to be able to pay grants, make payroll, pay our operating expenses. It looks nothing like this. It just keeps track of the cash that we have on hand. And that's a very, very useful thing to know as a financial leader. You do need to pay attention to what cash you have on hand, because we, especially as a foundation, we're in the business of paying out large amount in grant funds, so you want to make sure you have cash. This statement, which is mandated by the Financial Accounting Standards Board, is not nearly as useful for internal operations. I do want to point out again, this at the bottom, see accompanying notes. These statements are telling you something. Read the notes, they're important. And let's take a look at why that is. So beyond the basics, we're going to look at footnotes. So again, you see these on all the statements. The accompanying notes are an integral part of these financial statements. See accompanying notes to financial statements. And let's take a look at why. So here is the St. Paul Foundation, an affiliated organization. And this first couple of paragraphs actually tell you about the organization. Like, you know, just by reading the title, the St. Paul Foundation and affiliated organizations. What the heck does that mean? Well, if you read these first two paragraphs, it tells you exactly what that means. So it takes away any confusion. You now see what these affiliated organizations are, how it all is put together, and why they call it that. So very useful information. Also, I want to point out, you can see here, we talked about before regulatory compliance. Here again, here's an example of that. These statements have been prepared in accordance with US Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, or GAAP as it's known. Something that you should always see in financial statements of any US foundation and most of your grantees. There are other acceptable methods. For example, the cash basis. Some of your smaller grantees especially will prepare their statements in accordance with the cash basis or income tax basis, but the most prevalent will be Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, which is GAAP. You can see here, we talked about also OBMIFA, and you can see here again that this was subject to OBMIFA, so they mention that in the footnotes. Again, compliance issues, and again, putting that in the footnotes is helpful to the readers. Let's take another look. This is the California Wellness Foundation. Again, I loved this because it not only tells what the California Wellness Foundation is, I love that it puts the mission right in the beginning of the footnotes. It puts the goals of the foundation, and it talks about their Advancing Wellness Grants program. Anybody who's picking up this set of financial statements for the first time, just by reading this one page, gets to understand what this organization is all about. So very, very helpful. Now let's take a look of how footnotes can illuminate some things in the basic set of financial statements. Here's the Grand Rapids Community Foundation. And I looked at this line, funds held on behalf of nonprofit endowments. And I thought, what the heck does that mean? And it's $14.6 million. So I need to know what that is because it's a huge number. And then sure enough, we go to note 7 and it explains it beautifully. And the little table at the bottom ties directly to that financial statement. The numbers match. I feel much more comfortable about understanding what this is, and my question has been answered. So good job.
All right.
Another example, the Bateman Family Foundation and subsidiaries. Bequest receivable means, what does that mean? Somebody, you were hoping somebody's going to die? You know, So, lo and behold, note 4 tells you exactly what the bequest receivable is. And one of their principal sponsors passed away and leaving a bequest. The bequest just hadn't made it into the foundation yet. So again, good job. San Francisco Foundation, another example, agency funds. It sounds benign enough, but again, if you look at this, that's $19 million because these statements are in thousands. So what is that? And it's a liability. So they owe $19 million to somebody. So I want to know what that is. And once again, there's a note that talks about agency funds. So many of your questions can be answered by looking at the footnotes. So I want to just hit on this again, that they are an integral part of the financial statements. Once again, good job. And one more example, the Ford Foundation. There's a line with no number associated with it. Contingencies, commitments, and guarantees. Sounds kind of scary. Here it is. It tells me exactly what that is. These are things that don't make it to the actual financial statement because they haven't happened yet, but they're giving you a heads up that part of this stuff may happen. It's committed, you know, and they're assuming things are going to happen in the future, so they're disclosing that. Again, it gives you much more insight into what's going on with that organization. So good job. Let me talk a little bit about budgets. And I'm going to read a definition. I hate it when people read off slides, but I think it's important. Wikipedia, purpose of budgeting is to provide a forecast of revenues and expenditures. That is, construct a model of how our business might perform financially if certain strategies, events, and plans are carried out. Very important. I mean, I think that's something that you as financial leaders should understand. Also, enable the actual financial operation of the business to be measured against the forecast, something you'll be doing for the rest of your careers. Or in the case of a project, and your grantees are familiar with this, establish the cost constraint for a project, program, or operation. I think that's critical. And often in audited financial statements, you will not see actual results against forecast. You'll typically use this more on an internal basis, and I'm sure many of your grantees will present you with financial statements that do show their performance against their budgets. Here's an example of one. The Florida Philanthropic Network does do it against budget. This was their statement of activities January through October of 2012. And again, you can see that there's the actual column, there's the budget column, and then there's a dollar over or under budget column. And, again, if I were looking at this statement, I would want to look at these things because certain things are happening where they're going over budget by more than 100%, or there's these large negative variances in that variance column. So it just kind of gives you a chance to ask appropriate questions when you're reviewing the statement of another organization, or if it's your own organization. This is when you want to really understand, okay, what caused these big variances, because something looks out of whack compared to what we thought was going to happen when we set the budget. The Council on Foundations actually recommends best practices in managing foundation investments. And I'll let you read this, but I just want to point out that there are many organizations that are trying to help you with this. Many philanthropic infrastructure type organizations have things that can help you determine what you need to do as a philanthropic leader. So take advantage of those. Look on websites of things like Council on Foundations or Grant Makers for Effective Organizations or Independent Sector. They have tools that can help you fulfill this responsibility as a leader. Finally, the last section I want to cover are just some quick tools. These are tools that you can have in your tool belt that can just give you a quick snapshot as to whether an organization seems to be healthy or not. You can do the sort of 30-second review of a grantee financial statement to see if there are troubles or not. So the first one is current ratio. And what current ratio is total current assets divided by total current liabilities. Now, unfortunately, that's not always as easy to find out as you would like, because current assets technically mean any assets that can be turned into cash within 1 year. Sometimes it's hard to tell by looking at the financial statements what is current and what is not. Obviously, cash is always a current asset. Most marketable securities are current assets. Things like buildings, computer equipment, they're not current assets. But there are sometimes many gray areas in between, so you kind of have to make an educated guess. And the same with total current liabilities. Technically, total current liabilities are any liabilities that are due within 1 year. Accounts payable, almost always a current liability. You get into debt, if an organization has taken out debt, they might have some of that's due within a year, and some of it may be like a 20-year mortgage. So that would not be current liabilities. It's helpful. Some organizations actually break this down in this way, and we'll see that in just a minute. But what this tells you, if you can figure out what's current, it provides an insight as to the organization's cash flow. And if the current ratio is at least 1.0, that means they've got enough cash, current assets on hand to at least pay their debt for a year. So here is an example. Again, this is the Florida Philanthropic Network. You can see, I love it. They broke down their current assets. We don't have to guess. We don't have to think. It's right there. Total current assets, $371,000. Here's the second part of their balance sheet, statement of financial position. Total current liabilities, $166,000. If you do the math, their current ratio is 2.23, which is terrific. That means they have basically 2.25 years worth of current assets to cover their debt. So that's a pretty strong current ratio. So again, it's a great tool if you can figure out what is current. Here's another one that's a little easier, and it's called the quick ratio. The quick ratio is you take cash, and almost every organization will list cash on their statement of financial position, and accounts receivable, and you divide by total current liabilities. Again, same issue there. You've got to figure out what total current liabilities are. But this shows the assets that can be quickly turned into cash. I mean, it's not even just current assets. It's literally cash and accounts receivable. And again, you want the quick ratio to be at least 1.0, and that's a helpful indication of the health. So let's take that same organization, because I like the way their balance sheet lays this all out. Here's cash, easy to see. And then there's current liabilities. We saw that before. So if you do the math, their cash and accounts receivable, they didn't have any accounts receivable, so we just took cash divided by current liabilities, 2.21. It's not far off of their current ratio. So again, very strong financial position. The last thing, the last quick tool is the debt ratio. The debt ratio is debt or borrowings. This is much easier to get typically on a statement of financial positions. Almost any organization, if they have debt or any kind of borrowings, will list those. And then unrestricted net assets. As you saw on all the statements we looked at, everybody always discloses unrestricted net assets. So this amount measures the amount of debt. And in this case, the lower the ratio, the better. If it exceeds 1.0, then an organization could have difficulty in paying its bills. So let's take a look. We've got the Annie E. Casey Foundation here. And you can see they've got clearly an amount of debt on their statement of financial position. And then you can see their unrestricted net assets. So again, doing the math, they've got a debt ratio of 0.069, well below 1. So they should have no difficulty paying their debts. Obviously, these ratios aren't foolproof, but it's a good sort of quick gauge, quick rule of thumb about whether there are some serious issues going on with these organizations. So with that, again, they made it. What kind of questions can I answer for you?
Question. Hi, this is Brennan Gould with the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation. Thanks so much for all this information. So we've talked a lot and thought about organizations that, might be the non-traditional, sort of established grantees and the role that they play in some of the kind of impact and equity work that we might be doing. And so I'm curious to know how you think about organizations that maybe don't have some of the kind of ratio numbers or cash on hand, or just things like that you would look for and consider a healthy, good organization.
Excellent question. And we do that all the time at our organization, because in one of the areas we grant in, physical science, research in the physical sciences, we're granting to MIT and to Stanford and to UC Berkeley. These organizations have billions of dollars in assets. Then we have our human rights program that are giving to organizations that have like an annual budget of $100,000. Mm-hmm. So obviously their financial statements look much different. They're not nearly as sophisticated. So that all has to be part of the risk analysis that you're doing. And if this is a key grantee partner and you believe in the leadership and you're having conversations about the work that they're doing, you probably have to take more risk in making those grants. It's got to be a risk in relation to the impact you're trying to make and in relation to the realistic landscape that these organizations are operating. So yeah, these ratios that I just gave you, probably some of those little organizations will fail those ratios. But if you've got confidence in the leadership of that organization, that can mitigate part of the risk. And whenever we have any kind of a grant summary where the financials just look terrible, we'll have a conversation, myself as the sort of head of finance here, and the program officer will talk with the grantee, and we'll just document that because of X, Y, or Z, we feel that the risk to the foundation is adequately mitigated. In other words, we're willing to take the risk. We feel it's worth the bet. So that's something you're always going to have to weigh, and it can't be just black and white, because again, those kind of organizations will fail some of these ratios, and that's to be understood. But very good question.
Thanks.
Jeff, I have a private foundation related question.
Yep.
Are they required by law to issue audited financial statements? Because I typically don't encounter private foundations doing that, but I noticed that in the room there were some private foundations that issued audited financial statements. So just curious about thinking behind that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe it's a state by state. I know in California there is a regulation that insists that all nonprofits with operating budgets at some ridiculously low number, like $100,000 or $1 million or something, are required to issue audited financial statements. And that, of course, includes all private foundations. So I believe it is a state by state basis. Again, I think as private foundations look towards transparency, I think many of them choose to do it just to be more transparent and then post those audited financial statements on their websites. But I don't believe that there's a federal mandate to do so. I believe it is governed by state law.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jeff, thank you for this. This is really helpful. As we think about, so I'm at the San Francisco Foundation. We're starting to think about how we take our racial and economic equity agenda and really think about our various roles as grant maker, as investor, all of those things, as advisor, donors. And we have a new CFO, and we're thinking about how to move into mission-related investments. We're also, we have we piloted a PRI program, which we might want to bring to scale. So I would just want to know, are there other ways that finance and the finance and the program department really can work together effectively to advance those kinds of goals, whether they're part of the work of the foundation in the way that we do our work and or how we work with our grant partners?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And obviously you've named two. I mean, PRIs and MRIs, I think, should be an integral effort between finance and the program teams. You need to understand all the financial terms that go with those kind of deals. I think one of the things that I find here in partnering with my program teams is determining what could be done through direct charitable activities as opposed to direct grants to an organization. For example, if we're funding research that's going to benefit the field, before I came here, the way this foundation treated those is they just treated those all as administrative expenses, and they don't need to be. There are very, there's a lot of good examples when you're doing things that will benefit the field at large. It can be a direct charitable activities and be treated as, in terms of payout and all that kind of stuff, the same as a grant would be. And I think that opened up a lot of options for our program teams once they realized that they could do these direct charitable activities. And we actually have some very elaborate direct charitable activities going on now in this organization. And it's just because I kind of cracked that door open, and they realized that they didn't have to actually make a grant to a specific grantee, and they could still benefit a whole cohort of grantees. So I think that's a great way. And then I think, as you're talking about financial due diligence, or if a grantee gets in trouble, or if a grant goes awry, there are a number of ways that I think the finance team can help work with those grantees to figure out a way out, figure out a workaround. So I think there should be a real partnership between finance and the grants team or program teams.
And Jeff, just a follow-up, does your finance team train or onboard any of the program staff around their financial due diligence of the grants that they do?
We do, and then we bring in outside, like the Nonprofit Finance Fund, we bring them in, and they kind of have a canned presentation that they do. So yeah, we definitely do provide that training, and we repeat it, on a regular basis.
Jeff, this is Jonesy. Rochelle and I had the pleasure of working with you.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
Technology. So along with the question that Kay just asked, will you be willing to share what that looks like? Because I don't think our foundation does that in terms of onboarding our program staff. They just kind of, on their own or whatever. I'm not saying they don't do a good job, but that's another connect point too. In addition to, I'm hoping our CFO will know more about that than our program staff, just from a natural fit. So are you able to share how that's done? And
Sure. I mean, at the moment, like for example, this presentation that I just gave you, pardon me, I have used to present before to program teams, not at my current foundation, but at the James Irvine Foundation. I would give this kind of on a regular basis. Here we've used the Nonprofit Finance Fund to do that, and again, it's a similar thing. They go a little bit more in depth because they're coming on site for like a couple of hours. We just redid our sort of grant guidelines here, and I wrote a section of, you know, what financial due diligence should look like and where they should use me to help them.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share that language with you guys.
That would be
Yes,
helpful.
please. Yes.
At the Irvine Foundation, one thing I did, which after that, the horror story that I told you about the bankruptcy issue, I developed a training that we walked our program teams through, and then I developed this very lengthy checklist for them to use to look at financial statements of each grantee. Pardon me. And that, I know a lot of foundations copied that after I developed it. We found it got kind of cumbersome because we had all these program officers basically trying to put on a financial hat and really dive deep into the financial statements. And then when we implemented a new grants database, Foundation Connect is what we ended up using, it was easy for them to just assign me a task to look at financial statements for the due diligence piece. But what was tremendous is that because we had gone through those trainings, I suddenly had program officers forwarding me a task saying, okay, you need to look at this statement. But they were able to highlight red flags. Look at the statement of activities. Something looks off in the, you know, net assets released from restriction or whatever. They had enough knowledge to know where the problem areas were. And it was great because they were able to focus me in on where I really needed to look. So the training, I think, helped in that way, just getting the common language, the common vernacular. And again, I'm happy to share any of that. Even the checklist that I developed, I still have it. We moved away from it at Irvine, but it did help to at least give that common language.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Is there other?
Jeff,
Okay, hi, Rochelle. Way back there.
way back here. Just keeping on this theme, this is actually part of my project that I'm working on for the
Right.
Pathways project is on financial due diligence and trying to streamline and actually come up with a plan for the California Wellness Foundation, because we have we have a rule that we in finance look at only grants that are over 500,000, and everything else gets looked at by program officers that we're still could be giving a grant for $450,000 that never come across the desk for the finance team. And so I was wondering if you had any guidelines that you use, and maybe can share, you know, as a finance person, it's hard for me to understand how much knowledge, you know, our program team has, and it's really, from what I understand, not very consistent because different, you know, levels of people have different levels of knowledge, and if you can give us some guidelines on that.
Well, good question. It's hard for me to give guidelines. What I can say is what you need to consider. Again, it's the risk profile of the foundation. Your foundation has made, from what I understand, the assessment that grants below 500,000 are fairly low risk, because they're saying that they don't require a higher level of financial due diligence, and that's fine. There's nothing to say that that's wrong. At my foundation, we use $100,000. Anything that's $100,000 gets a much lower level of financial due diligence. We also put into place renewals. If it's a grantee that has had a renewal within the past 2 years where there was a full financial due diligence done, we're saying that you don't need to do it again, you know, within a 2-year period of time, assuming that, you know, you have good ongoing relationships with that grantee. We've also excluded major universities from our financial due diligence. The fact that I'm looking at Stanford's financial statements at, $28 billion in net assets, that's just a waste of everybody's time here at the foundation. So we've excluded all major universities from our financial due diligence. So I think it just depends on your risk tolerance. If you are looking at having program teams do all grants 500,000 or less, I would suggest that you do have some training so that they at least have the basics and give them key things to look for. Decreases in net assets above a certain percentage or something like that should get kicked up to a higher level review, that type of thing.
Great, thanks.
Sean Drew with the Bush Foundation in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Yes, Sean.
Curious about when you see orgs that prospective grantees that may have some red flags in their account. You talked earlier about, the balance sheet doesn't balance. That tells you something is sloppy or screwing way. Do you guys at times step in and trying to help them with their books, either giving them a technical assistance grant or, if you think the work that they're doing is valuable and that it's not about they're trying to be slick, but that's not their core competency?
We are just beginning a program to do that very thing. We're calling it, organizational effectiveness, but we are asking our program teams to give us any indication of grantees that they think might need that help. And we're having a separate team talk to the grantees because we don't want the primary program officer who's responsible for their major, project grants to then be talking about how to fix their broken organization. So we're having a separate team come in and sort of handle that so that there's, you can have more candid conversations with that secondary team and not affect the primary relationship for that program team. But yes, I think that's if you really believe in this grantee and they need help financially, then yeah, why not give them some kind of a technical assistance grant? And there are a couple of foundations. I know the Haas Junior Foundation in San Francisco, and there's another one whose name escapes me, but they have developed a tremendous program to do just this, and they have a whole cadre of consultants that can be deployed to help grantees in cases like this. So we're going to be partnering with them as we deploy this new program.
Thank you.
Sure. The Grand Rapids Community Foundation does that as well. It's called nonprofit.
Who was that?
Grand Rapids Community Foundation.
Okay, great. I was not aware of that. Terrific.
Center for Philanthropy. Yep.
Great.
I've heard a lot about, foundations should be spending more than the 5% of their endowments. And wanted to hear if you had any other examples, with the exception of those foundations that are spending down their endowments, where foundations are doing innovative things to increase that amount or use it in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
One thing we did this year, which is new and that we got buy-in from the board, is that we looked probably in April, we're on a fiscal year in June, that ends in June, and we started to project what our savings would be in salaries and in operations. And then with those projections, as they got closer, we transferred those to our grant making budget instead of putting it back into the endowment. And so and the board is now excited about that. We're probably going to do it moving forward, but I was wondering if there were other things like that that could get more resources out.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously the flip side of that is you've got to protect the endowment. Assuming you have no more inflows into your foundation, like my current foundation, we have living donors that continue to dump tons of money in. So, our payout is something like 20% at the moment. That's not sustainable forever. But at the moment, we're not burdened by that. But when I was at the Irvine Foundation, for example, there were no inflows other than the investment earnings. So, that is something you have to balance. I know one thing that foundations are looking at is, and this kind of goes with, you may have heard about the full cost project or the real cost project. It's called different things in different parts of the country. But building efficiencies in, like giving multi-year grants. The grantees appreciate that because they can rely on the funds for more than just a year at a time. And it actually streamlines the grant making processes in the foundation. So therefore, you're actually able to translate more of that into grant dollars as opposed to administrative costs shepherding, year by year grants. And it also helps manage payout over a multi-year horizon as opposed to 1 year at a time. And then I know that foundations often do sort of one-off kind of things. For example, at the Irvine Foundation, after the big economic downturn in 2008, 2009, most foundations started contracting their grant making because all of our endowments were hit very hard. We decided to do 2 years worth of much higher payout grant making, knowing that it would dip into the endowment, but because we knew our grantees needed it more than we did at that time. And yes, our endowment did dip a little bit over those couple of years. But we felt that was necessary to react to what was going on with our grantees.
Thank you.
So we're almost at time, about 3 minutes. Is there a burning question someone has? And you want to get in before we thank Jeff?
Jeff, so this is Melina. I'm actually at the Irvine Foundation now.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we're actually going to be launching somewhat of the kind of technical assistance support to seeing those grantees who really need to build up their financial capacity. Be able to share out with the group maybe some more information about examples you've seen, because I think we've been trying to figure out, would we just have them work with consultants, would we give them an actual grant? So it'd be interesting to learn more about the models you're a part of.
I'm sorry, I missed you don't seem to be near a microphone. I missed the early part of your setup there, so I didn't understand the question. Sorry.
If you could just maybe send information about the cohort model of the financial TA. We're looking at that as well, and it would be great to learn from you and also hear others how you approached it.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. I won't do that here, but I did want to make sure you all have my email address, correct? I know somebody there does, but please share it, and anything you want along those lines, I'm happy to share, with you. I've got a lot of documents that I can share and sort of checklists, that type of thing. So I would be happy to send you that kind of stuff.
Okay, let's give Jeff a hand.
Good luck. Enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
All right.
Take care.
Boom. 12:59.
That's what it means.
Good.